Well, hello there. My name is Aiden. I'm one of the pastors here at Kiama Anglican Church, and this week we're looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 4. I guess by way of starting out, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I approach the book of Ecclesiastes. Really, when you think about how this book works, it's a lot like the book of Revelation, which we've just studied at Kiama, in that it's a book that you need to feel as much as you kind of intellectually understand it. Ecclesiastes is a book that provokes you to think and to reflect on and to kind of mull over. So I'm not 100% sure that there's any one right answer when it comes to understanding Ecclesiastes, or any one thing that you're supposed to get out of it, outside of the conclusion that comes at the end of chapter 12. So there are even people in the world who read Ecclesiastes as, well, an exercise in listening to a madman, or at least a kind of theistic nihilist, where the final verses of the book come almost as a relief, like, well, now that you've listened to all of that, fear God and keep his commandments. That's not quite how I read it, because there are some very interesting moments in Ecclesiastes, but what I'm trying to say is it's not straightforward to read in the way that, say, the Gospels are. But that difficulty of wisdom literature, the question of what am I supposed to do with this, well, that's also one of the things that I most love about it. It doesn't teach us in such a way that it makes us masters, people who can say that we are wise. Actually, Proverbs 3 verse 7 says, don't be wise in your own eyes. Because of course the truly wise woman or man is always learning and never the master. And when they stop learning, well, again, Proverbs warns that pride goes before the fall. So if you've been tracking through this series and feel like you don't fully grasp Ecclesiastes, I think that's okay. Actually, that's kind of the dance. That's the journey. That's what it is. You don't master it, you wrestle with it. A little bit like how Jacob wrestled with God. And sure, you might come away limping, but also changed for the better. So that's what we're going to do. I can't give everything the time that I should, but if we get some things rattling around in your head and helping you to think biblically and Christianly, then I think we'll call that a success. The writer in Ecclesiastes is taking us on this journey. And at the end of chapter 3, we get a note that resonates with the kind of people who are activists. You know, the kind who say, no justice, no peace. Ecclesiastes 3:16 says, I observed under the sun that there is wickedness at the place of judgment, and there is wickedness at the place of righteousness. You know that it's not supposed to be that way, right? The place of judgment is supposed to be the place where wickedness is crushed. You don't murder in a courtroom. The place of righteousness or justice shouldn't be a place of wickedness. And yet, both are compromised. You know, I saw in the news last week that some policemen in Victoria had actually beat up a disabled man and pled guilty, and yet they had no conviction recorded against them. And I don't know about you, but to me, that just doesn't sound right. See, we might think that no justice, no peace is a modern phrase, but the truth is that it's one of the defining threads of the human story. It's there in Ecclesiastes, it was there in Victoria last week, and it'll be there in our own lives as well. The writer wrestles with this uncomfortable truth in a kind of, well, it's almost a pious philosophical two-step. They give the Sunday school answer that, well, I know that God will bring judgment, but then straight away they kind of question that as they wrestle with their thought that, well, we're like animals, we die like they do, and who knows what happens afterwards. And it gets to the point where at the end of chapter 3, the advice is enjoy what you can, because who knows what happens after death. It's not cheery stuff, and it gets worse. The start of chapter 4 is one of the darkest parts of the book. The author basically says, better to have never been than to be and to see the things that are done. They're not the most inspirational words, are they? Nana's probably not going to do you a cross-stitch of Ecclesiastes 4:3. Better the one who has not yet existed, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. That's dark. But you know, it's interesting because even as the writer casts this shadow of injustice and oppression and heaviness, at the same time, we're approaching one of the nicest parts of the book, one that gets quoted at weddings. But in the lead up, it's hard to believe that what follows this darkness could possibly be popular with brides and grooms. But I guess maybe it's true that the darker the night, the brighter the stars. And maybe it's a bit like that here. We don't see the stars just yet. There are a few more grim steps to take on our philosophical journey. Verse 4, the writer of Ecclesiastes says, all labour and all skillful work is due to one person's jealousy of another. Is that a sour take on the human state or what? He's saying that when you look at a manicured lawn, a great work of art or architecture or a skillful musician, the driving force behind their art was jealousy. I want to be loved and admired. I want the good life. Ouch. And this too is futile and a pursuit of the wind, because of course they die and so do you. Verse 5, another step in this dark path. It says the fool folds his arms and consumes his own flesh. See, it's saying that laziness creates lack, and lack creates the worst kind of desperation. But of course, on the other side of the scale, there's the opposite of the lazy person, which is the frantic workaholic. Verse 7 and 8 reflect on the one who is driven, consumed, overtaken by working and earning. That's not somebody who consumes their own flesh like the fool. These are the captains of industry. But again, for what? In the end, it's all taken away by death. Nothing lasts. Did you know that Jeff Bezos, that's Mr. Amazon, the Amazon billionaire, he could spend $10 million a day, every day, for the rest of his life and never run out of money? But on what? What's the point? Now we arrive at that spot of light, the star in the darkness. Now, before I read it, I want you to know that people often think of this part of the Bible as a wedding passage, and it's important to realize that it's not. Not at all. In fact, it's contrasted with verse 8, which says that there is a person, Hebrew masculine, there's a man without a companion, without even a son or brother. And that is what's contrasted in verse 9, where it says that two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their efforts. For if either falls, his companion can lift him up, but pity the one who falls without another one to lift him up. Also, if two lie down together, they can keep warm. But how can one person alone keep warm? And if someone overpowers one person, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. You see, what these verses are saying is that companionship, friendship, family bonds and partnership, there's a joy in those things. They make us strong. And so as much as life might be transitory, there's a joy in sharing it with the people around us, people we can trust. Marriage is one possible expression of that, but it is by far not the only one. Also, in passing, I just want to note something regarding the three-stranded cord. You see, people often read this passage and they'll think, well, hey, the author here is talking about partnership. He talks about two and then suddenly starts talking about a three-stranded cord. Is the third strand God? And the answer is no. I mean, it could be in your story, but the idea of the three-stranded cord actually comes from an older tradition, from a traditional story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the hero Gilgamesh convinces his friend Enkidu to help him to slay the monster Humbaba, the demonic guardian of the cedar forest, Gilgamesh says to Enkidu that a three-stranded cord is hardest to break. And being convinced by Gilgamesh's logic, Enki and Gil team up, slay Humbaba, and then grab a selfie together. And in case you think it's a bit of a stretch to say that Ecclesiastes might be coming from that story in some ways, have a listen to Gil's last words to Enkidu, his friend. This is what he says in the Babylonian story. Mankind can number his days. Whatever he may achieve, it is only wind. Does that sound familiar? So the point of the three-stranded cord language is not to say, get hitched, get married. No, the point is that if you have to go on an epic quest to slay the demonic guardian of the cedar forest, take a friend along. Or, coming back to Ecclesiastes, the point is that when you face the corruption and difficulty and darkness of this world, you're better off in partnership with others. That's why church is so important. Not the event on a Sunday alone, but the family of God who stand together, facing a world of darkness, shining as a light for King Jesus. Actually, speaking of kings, let's stop past verse 13 to 16 before we finish. I'm going to fly a kite here, and it's highly likely I'm not the first to suggest what I'm going to, but at the same time, I'm not drawing this from a commentary that I've read. So, like always, take it or leave it. See, as I read these verses, I find them oddly specific. I wonder how you feel about them. Verse 13 says, "Better is a poor but wise man than an old but foolish king who no longer pays attention to warnings. For he came from prison to be king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom." Interesting. I don't know if you spot it, but that's the story of King David. That might not be who the author of Ecclesiastes has in mind, but it is the story of David. David was a poor but wise youth. Remember, he was a shepherd. King Saul, the king of Israel before David, had become evil and corrupt and stopped fearing the Lord. David came from nothing, and as God raised David up, Saul made him an outlaw. And yet in the end, the kingdom was David's. Now, check out what the next verse says. Verse 15, "I saw all the living who move about under the sun follow a second youth who succeeds this king." One who comes after the outsider king is followed by everyone under the sun. Who could that be? Well, you might remember that the blind men on the road to Jerusalem called Jesus the Son of David. He is called the King of Kings, and the scripture speaks of a day when every knee will bow before him, whether in heaven, on earth, or even under the earth. Verse 16 continues, "There is no limit to all the people who were before them. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. Jesus was raised to life, back from the dead. He walked through the valley of the shadow of death and back up out the other side. And yet our world ignores him. The most significant event in human history split our calendar in two, and yet it fades to nothing for so many. Talk about vapor. Let's connect some dots. We live in a world of no justice, no peace. The activists aren't wrong. Companionship brightens the darkness, but like Gilgamesh said to Enkidu, mankind can number his days. Whatever he may achieve, it is only wind. And yet, in the heaviness of Ecclesiastes 4, in the darkness and wind, there's a glimmer, a flicker of hope, a strange prophetic spark which speaks of a king who would come and be followed by everyone. And yes, in time, he would be forgotten by many. But you know that's not the end of the story because you've read Revelation. You know that in the midst of the heavenly throne, there's a Lamb, the Lord Jesus, who will come again in glory to judge the quick and the dead. O prophet, won't you prophesy and tell of the one who makes all things count, even in this transitory life?